So I don't have an explanation, so fortunately I have to admit that this is going to be somewhat unsatisfying by the end. We still don't have a good explanation for what I'm going to show you, but these patterns I think are still very interesting, and I hope that they might interest you. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me at this prestigious seminar series. It's a great honor to be here. I've been at the Center for Theoretical Study for the past month, and it's been such a pleasure to be here and to get to know some of the people working here. So I'm going to be speaking about nature's recurring number. It's this number that appears over and over in very different systems and very different levels of organization. And I think it's fascinating, and I think if we could understand it, it would provide a lot of insight into many biological questions. So just an overview of what I'll be speaking about. I'll start with an overview of what power laws are and how they've been studied in biology to give us a bit of a flavor of what we're going to be talking about, because the whole talk is going to be about power laws. And so basically they're straight line regressions on log-log axes. And then I'm going to show at the ecosystem level that there are these patterns that emerge across whole biomes of the world. And so I'll show predators against prey and how the trophic structure of an ecosystem is very predictable. And then I'll present that underpinning this relationship are growth-mass relationships between the productivity and the biomass of a community. And that form of growth has profound implications for our understanding of stability in ecosystems. So the stability of trophic interactions, the stability of competitive interactions. And then I'll get into what the title suggested, scaling from embryos to whole ecosystems. We'll go from the embryonic level to the individual level, the population level, and the ecosystem level. And we'll see that growth at all these levels have very similar things in common. And then finally, we're going to try to go towards theory, try to understand these patterns in some way. But as David said, and as I admit fully right from the start, we don't have a theory yet. So it's really going to be a bit of hand waving at that point. But hopefully you'll find something of interest, and maybe you'll have some ideas as to where to go from there. So power law distributions and power law relationships. There's these two kinds of power laws. These are found in every field of science that has looked at them. Power law distribution is essentially you get a univariate, they're a univariate list of numbers. You class them into groups, and then you count how frequent those numbers are in each of these bins. And if it looks like a straight line on log-log axes, that's indicative of a power law. And then there's power law relationships. So these are bivariate, variable 1 against variable 2. If it's, again, a straight line on log axes, suggestive of a power law. So here are some examples of power laws in biology. The first one was the number of species per genus. So Homo sapiens, for example, has one species in the genus Homo. But there's some genuses that have very, very many species. And so the distribution of this follows a power law. And one of the first explanations for this has come to be known as preferential attachment, or the rich get richer. The same idea underpins the distribution of wealth. So 80% of the wealth in almost anywhere you look is controlled by 20% of the population. These indicate power law distributions. The number of parasites per host also follows this pattern. And generally the sizes of things. So the sizes of bodies in an ecosystem follows this pattern. The sizes of colonies in a landscape, of fires in a forest, of islands in an archipelago, and so on. So we're going to leave those behind. I just wanted to outline kind of the other side of the other kind of power law, but we're really going to be focusing on power law relationships, and in particular the last two. But I will say something about the species area curve, because I think it's quite well known. And in fact, it's something that David's worked on, and recently he's shown that in fact it's it's only power law over a certain size range, over a certain scale. If you get down to very small scales or very large scales, then the pattern is actually closer to linear, but it's only within those two extremes that you see this power law. But the two I'm going to be focused on today are mass versus mass on log-log axes. Straight line relationship suggests a power law, and we're going to have these two types of relationships. So structural power laws are mass of something against the mass of something else, and a functional power law is the rate of some process against the mass. So this is the earliest power law. It's brain size to body size. It was discovered by Eugene Dubois, who was seeking the missing link between man and ape, and discovered Java man, and then plotted the primate brain sizes against body size and found a power law. And since then, now we know it extends all the way down to shrews, all the way up to whales, and essentially the exponent or the slope of this relationship is less than 1. So it says that as a body gets bigger, the brain also gets bigger, but at a diminishing rate. And so we can look at a body, we can look at a picture of an animal without knowing what it is and get a sense of its size just by the relationship between the size of the head and the size of the body. And because the reason is because this relationship is very regular. So the way that this was rationalized was that underpinning this structural relationship of mass against mass, there's some function, there's some growth rates. And so if the brain grows at rate A, you can ignore the math. I just put it up there for anyone that's interested. But if the brain grows at rate A, the body grows at rate B, then the slope of this relationship is going to be A over B. And what's interesting about that is that we've derived this structural relationship from some underlying growth process. So we've derived structure from function. The other kind of power law that's really famous is the metabolic to body mass power law. So this was discovered in 1932 by Max Kleiber, Proctor, and Brody. And basically it says that as your body gets bigger, also your metabolism gets bigger, but at a diminishing rate. The slope is less than 1. And so an elephant obviously has a much bigger metabolism than a mouse, but on a tissue-specific basis, per gram of tissue, its metabolism is much lower. And that's why elephants are, slow and lumbering, and mice are flitting about very quickly because they have much higher metabolism. So this pattern is very interesting, but underpinning this relationship, it's often assumed that there are some structural constraints. So the classic one is surface and volume. Obviously, a body can only a body can only produce as much heat as it can dissipate, otherwise it overheats. So if it can only dissipate heat across a surface, the surface is going to increase as the square of the length of the body, whereas the volume of the body is going to increase as the cube of the length. And so the body can only ever produce as much heat as it can dissipate, so metabolism is going to vary with mass to the power 2/3. Now, in fact, we know that the exponent is near to 3/4, so I guess that's because we have lots of fractal, rough structures inside us that allow us to dissipate heat more than we'd expect. But the explanation for 3/4 is then, okay, well then there must be an effective fourth dimension, which comes about maybe from the architecture of the distribution network, filling space, and all the rest of it. But in any case, the exponent here is considered to be the ratio of d over d plus 1. It's a structural constraint, dimensional analysis. So underpinning this, the structural relationship of mass against mass, we have a functional explanation. Underpinning the functional relationship of rate versus mass, we have a structural rationale. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, instead we should explain these rate versus mass relationships by going deeper into the function. In essence, understanding the dynamics of this process rather than the structural constraints. Okay, so those are power laws. That's sort of the history of power laws in biology. And of course, biology is not alone in discovering how important these relationships are. Every field of science has gone through a period in the last kind of 20 years where they've discovered just how general these patterns are and how important they are. So I'm going to talk about power laws at a different level. This was physiology, brain mass, body mass, metabolic rate. I'm going to talk about power laws at the ecosystem level. So this is looking at where each point is a separate ecosystem somewhere in the world. And I'm going to start by talking about predators against prey. So that's a structural relationship, the mass of one trophic level against the mass of another trophic level. And then I'm going to link that to the functional relationship, what's underpinning that. And so as David mentioned at the start, the data I'm going to present was published in a paper a couple of years ago in Science, covering 1,000 peer-reviewed sources and drawing together data for more than 2,000 ecosystems worldwide. And where we started this research was in African savanna. Some of you are familiar with some of these systems, because I know there's a large group that works in Cameroon here. But anyway, these animals are beloved by all of us, I guess. Lions, hyenas, cheetahs, leopards, wild dog. And that group of 5 predators tends to feed on prey from the 500-kilogram buffalo down to the 5-kilogram dik-dik. So there's about 20 species of prey in that size range that are fed on by these 5 carnivores. And this is a very closely coupled trophic system. And so what we did was we tried to get all the data that we could find for each of these protected areas on the abundance of all these animals, how many there are per square kilometer. And so if you plot the population density, how many there are per square kilometer against their body mass, it's a big mess. Predators and prey vary over 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. But what's interesting is that when you sum up all the predators and all the prey for each of these protected areas and plot them on log-log axes, then this very striking regularity emerges. So here we have predator biomass against prey biomass, and we see a power law, essentially log-log axes. The exponent is about 3/4, 0.73, and here each point is a separate ecosystem. And yet, and you saw the data from which it derives from, it's a big mess, but yet at a community level somehow, these systems are lining up along this line quite regularly. What it's telling us is that as you go from sort of the Kalahari down here, which is over here, or Etosha, very depauperate system, not many animals, you have quite a lot of predators per prey, but as you get up to higher and higher densities, the prey biomass increases faster than the predator biomass, and you actually get a diminishing predator-to-prey ratio. So the question is, why are there not more lions in these very lush systems? And you can go to a place like Ngorongoro in East Africa and drive around and look out your window, you'll see herbivores everywhere, but you won't see that many predators. And you know, there's still lots more predators up there than there are in Kalahari, but far fewer than you would expect. And so each of these points is a separate ecosystem. If we did this plot in 1950, we did it in 1980, we did it now, we would basically see these points in the same place. In other words, these populations are varying, but they're compensating with one another, and this biomass is more or less constant through time. So here's some time series data. It's just to show you that, you know, when you look at these data through time for 4 representative systems, this is Kruger, Shishlui, Mfolozi, Serengeti, and Ngorongoro. There's some variation, but overall there's fairly constant abundances through time. So these systems are more or less at steady state. We can also ask, how is the mean body mass of all the individuals in that system changing with biomass? So that's like, so each point here is one of those ecosystems again, and we're going from the low prey biomass all the way up to high prey biomass. All the same animals are in all these systems, more or less, and their relative frequencies are all the same. It's just that up here, there's a lot more of them. So basically, it's not that, you know, the Kalahari is dominated by impala, and then the Ngorongoro is dominated by buffalo or something. It's all the same species, just at higher and higher densities. So, and this plot just shows the causes of mortality for these different trophic groups. You can see that almost all the mortality comes from predation for the herbivores, but for the carnivores, it's often intraspecific conflict and things of that sort. I'll try to come back to that at the end if there's time. But what this means is that these two groups are very tightly coupled, and we can write down a simple model that captures, I think, some of these dynamics. So this is a Lotka-Volterra model. It's like you've probably may have heard of in basic ecology or something like that. But what we've done is we've modified the growth term of the prey. dB by dt is equal to RB to the power k. In other words, we've included sub-exponential growth into the prey term. So if we didn't have that k, we'd basically have Lotka-Volterra. But with that k, we're changing the dynamics somewhat. And when we take the equilibrium solution, remember we said each of those points is basically near steady state. They're not changing very much. So we can make this assumption, and we see that at equilibrium we have a power law. Rg over m is as a constant here, because these parameters are assumed to be constant across this gradient. And so we recover the power law with this model. So what that's telling us is that underpinning this pattern, there's a parallel pattern between the prey productivity and the prey biomass that's paralleling this relationship. So underpinning this structural relationship is a functional relationship in the rate of growth of the prey community. Okay, so we talked about African systems. I want to show you data for other systems in East Africa, North America. Here we have tigers against their prey, wolves against their prey. Basically the same pattern we're seeing in these other mammal systems in other parts of the world. So again, we're seeing this more bottom-heavy trophic pyramid at higher and higher densities. And we're suggesting that underpinning that, the prey community is growing in parallel. Okay, and we can look at a completely different system, zooplankton to phytoplankton, in freshwater systems and in oceanic systems. And of course, plankton are notoriously variable, but when you get enough data, this pattern emerges where this trophic pyramid becomes more bottom-heavy. Yeah, so we don't have data to test if the actual productivity is changing in all these systems directly, but we can test that in other systems. And so we looked for other systems where we could measure productivity against biomass, and we found in grasslands and in forests and in seagrass beds and in plankton communities, very often we see this pattern where the productivity of the entire community, remember each point here is an ecosystem somewhere in the world, the productivity of the entire ecosystem is changing quite systematically, at least similarly in very many of these systems. So I think this is really interesting. I mean, you know, it's very macro. Like we're looking across biomes of the world, and we're finding these regular patterns. And to summarize, I mean, we can sort of connect the structural relationship between predators and prey to this functional relationship between the productivity and the biomass through this simple equation. But like David said, we don't really know where this productivity relationship really comes from. We have some confidence in our model, but I don't think that we really understand where this production biomass relationship is coming from. Just to give you an intuitive feel for what this is, when we're saying productivity to biomass is less than 1, it's telling us it's less than exponential. It's still growing. As the system gets bigger, its growth is still bigger, but it's diminishing. That growth is always less than it would have been, less than the proportionality would predict. So, okay, so I've talked about, I gave you some bit of background on power laws, and in particular structural and functional power laws in physiology, and how, you know, we've connected these things and rationalized them. I showed you data for predators and prey at the ecosystem level and for productivity and biomass at the same level, and we suggest that underpinning these, that these two kinds of relationships are connected. I want to talk about the consequences of that for some of the things that we understand in ecology, or things that we've debated in ecology. So, in particular, the consequences for stability. And so I said this functional form of growth is sub-exponential, and that means that that has consequences for our understanding of stability. So this is Lotka-Volterra. This is classic Lotka-Volterra. There's no k there. There's no exponent. And we know that as in Lotka-Volterra, that as prey increase, then predators increase, they catch up, they eat down the prey crash, then the predators crash, allows prey to grow back up, and this just keeps going on and on and on forever. Neutrally stable, depending on your initial conditions, you'll go around and around forever. There are some good things about this model. Most people like to say that this model is not very good because it doesn't predict really anything. Maybe the lynx and hare do this, but that system's very climatically driven. But one thing that's nice about it is that it's scale-free. There's no scale associated with it. So if we change the parameters, we'll still see the exact same dynamics, but at a completely different scale. And if you rescale the axes, you won't even know what you're looking at. That's not the case when we start to introduce logistic growth into the prey growth term, or some kind of more complicated functional response where there's saturation or something like that. But the problem is it oscillates forever. When we include that k, and when that k is less than 1, then these dynamics are dampened and the system goes to a stable equilibrium. And the model is still scale-free, so we can change the parameters to anything we want. We can start from any initial conditions, and the system will always stabilize to a fixed point. And so I think that that's quite interesting, because I don't know of any predator-prey model in ecology that has those kinds of properties. And so here's an example of, I told you that we could make a prediction about the intercept of this line from RG over M. And so the relationship between predators and prey is actually, the intercept can be predicted from the parameters RG and M. And that's what this dotted line is on this line, on this graph. So we've overlaid that there, and then we've also overlaid the dynamics starting from some arbitrary initial point. We can see that it cycles around and arrives at some fixed point on that graph. And so I think this model's powerful because it allows us to make clear predictions for what the intercept would be, and it allows us to have a model that's globally stable. But what we don't understand is how we get to different points along that line. And that's where this Q parameter comes in. And I'll try to talk about that at the end, because this is something that we still don't understand. But I'd like to talk about a competition model now, too, because this sub-exponential growth doesn't just stabilize predator-prey interactions, but it also stabilizes competitive interactions. And I showed you that the frequency of all the animals across this gradient of biomass isn't changing. You have all the same animals in the same relative proportions, suggesting that underpinning the community level pattern are the individuals following a similar growth pattern. And if that's the case, then it means that all of these competitors are actually following a similar growth law. And so here I've just chosen parameters where we get competitive exclusion. This is the classic Lotka-Volterra. And if we include sub-exponential growth here, it tends to stabilize these dynamics. And so here we get for the same parameters, including sub-exponential growth, leads to coexistence. Now, unfortunately, we can't say anything very strong about that because there are still parameters that could lead to competitive exclusion. But there are other simpler models than Lotka-Volterra, such as this one that's used in prebiotic chemistry and evolutionary theory, where they have similar dynamics to Lotka-Volterra, but when k is included and k is less than 1, it's globally stable. Now, that's a powerful statement, because that's saying that no matter the number of species that are interacting, no matter the parameters, we get complete coexistence all the time. And this has been proven mathematically with the Lyapunov function, so we can say very strongly that with k less than 1, it has the tendency to stabilize both competition dynamics and predator-prey dynamics. So this is just summarizing that. But what that means is that many of the dichotomies and the paradoxes that have beset ecological theory for a long time can be resolved by some intrinsic growth process rather than invoking anything external to the system, such as heterogeneities in space and time, or frequency dependence, or coevolution, or whatever. These are all essentially these can be overcome essentially by something intrinsic to the growth process. So the model that I showed with the exponent for predators and prey is not either top-down or bottom-up. It's both. Prey interact with predators and predators interact with prey, and they stabilize each other. That's not the case, though, for other models like the Rosenzweig-MacArthur. I don't know if you know this stuff. I might be talking too fast about this, but essentially all of these dichotomies and paradoxes can be overcome by the intrinsic form of growth itself. Obviously, diversity versus stability, as you increase the number of competitors, the system tends to destabilize. Not the case with sub-exponential growth. The paradox of the plankton is not a paradox because any number of competitors can coexist on a limited set of resources. So I think that the understanding the form of growth can be very powerful for understanding the balance of nature, the stability of ecological interactions. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about I guess I'm talking fast because it's been half an hour. I get so excited, you know. I get so excited and I start talking, and especially when I'm in front of an audience and I'm not sure if you understand. So I think I better talk faster so that they're probably way ahead of me and you're probably not. Should I go back and start over? I feel like 27 minutes. What? Okay, let me just recap, and I guess I should slow down because we have time here, and tomorrow's a holiday, and I'm just like buzzing along, and I'm sorry about that. All right, so I've talked about this pattern at the ecosystem level between predators and prey, and I related that to underpinning that is this functional relationship between growth and mass. And that's important because it tells us something deep about the structure of an ecosystem, for one thing, but it also tells us about it has dynamic implications for the stability of these ecosystems. Not only for the trophic structure and the trophic stability, but also the competitive stability. Now growth is very important, not just in ecology, but also in evolutionary theory. Of course, the ideas of fitness come down to ideas about growth. You know, Darwin called the struggle for existence the doctrine of Malthus. Well, the doctrine of Malthus is exponential growth. But yet, we're seeing in many systems that growth is actually sub-exponential. And that has very different dynamical consequences. So I think it's important to understand these patterns if we're going to understand it at a deeper level, some of the ecological interactions and potentially some of the processes that underpin evolution. So now I want to kind of take a step back and look at where the title comes from, scaling from embryos to ecosystems, I want to show you data at each of these different levels of organization. And this is what I think is really exciting, because we're seeing the same pattern emerge in very different levels of organization. So we've been talking about ecosystems, but now we're going to go kind of back to physiology and talk about individuals. And we're going to take a growth curve. So you can measure mass at different times. It grows up, and then it saturates. And you can get the maximum growth from that growth curve, which is the gradient of the inflection point, and plot it against the maximum mass. And so that's what we're going to be doing, is basically plotting growth versus mass, and we get it from these growth curves. So the first one is prenatal growth. This is the embryos basically going from shrew up to whale, and we see that this relationship is very regular. The exponent is 0.76. Next, we're going to look at ontogenetic growth. This is the growth after you're born, growing up to maturity. Again, maximum growth against mass, and we see that the exponent there is 0.72. We can look at the reproductive growth. So this is the amount of mass produced by a female in 1 year, an adult female, through her offspring. So how much offspring mass is produced in 1 year. And again, the exponent is 0.73. We can look at social insect colonies. So these are the whole colony mass, the whole colony growth, and they're plotted on the same line as individuals. So the white points are individuals, the black points are whole colonies. So these are really super organisms in a very quantitative sense. And then we'll finish this. This is bringing together all the large mammal data for each of the communities that we looked at in Africa and in North America and in Southeast Asia, and putting them on one plot. So here each point is an ecosystem. We've already seen this data. I'm just putting it together so that I can make this slide. And this is the slide that I think is the most beautiful slide I could possibly show you. This is where the title of the talk comes from, scaling from embryos to ecosystems. I'm showing you data for prenatal growth, individual growth, population growth, and whole communities. And in each case, the exponent is around 0.72 or 3 or 6 or something like that. I consider that quite similar. I think ecologists would consider that quite similar. Maybe there's physicists here that are like, well, that's not similar in my field. But really, that's about as similar as it gets. And I think this is fascinating. And I wish I had an explanation. Does anyone, I sometimes ask, who thinks that it's the same explanation underpinning this pattern? And maybe I'll ask for a show of hands, if I can. Is that okay to do in Europe? Who thinks it's the same abstract process underpinning all of these relationships? Obviously, there are very different ways of measuring, very different data that we're collecting. I won't ask, because I'm just going to get 0 hands if I say one or the other, and then I'll feel bad. Okay, so, but actually, we're quite accustomed to doing this in biology. When we talk about exponential growth, we're not interested in the system itself. We don't have anything that's underpinning the system, and we can apply exponential growth to the growth of bacteria in a petri dish, the growth of money in a bank account, the growth of the universe. So very different systems we can all apply to exponential growth or logistic growth. So basically, we want the same thing for this. We want a mathematical explanation that could explain why we have this same pattern. And just so you don't think I'm cherry-picking mammals because we have these very clear delineations of levels of organization. We can go back to the data that I showed you before. This is all the ecosystem data, and compare it to the individual data. This is maximum individual growth against body mass for these major taxa. And we see here that the exponents for these growth relations are almost identical at these 2 levels of organization, going all the way down to the tiniest single-celled protists. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, that's obvious. You know, ecosystems are comprised of individuals, so the scaling at the ecosystem level should just be a reflection of the individual level. But that's not the case. These scaling laws are emerging independent of one another. And the way we can test that is to ask, how is the mean body mass for all the individuals changing in an ecosystem? You remember I showed you for African systems, the mammals basically don't change their mean body size as we change biomass. As biomass increases, the mean size for all the animals is essentially the same. That's true for these other ecosystems as well. We see that for mammals, forests, fish, and plankton, there's not really any systematic pattern that would suggest any kind of connection between individual level scaling and ecosystem level scaling. There is some change in size structure in marine systems, but nowhere near enough to account for this similarity. And so, you know, if you don't really, this is like saying the mean size of all the individuals in an ecosystem is similar to asking, what is the mean size of your cells in your body as the body gets bigger from kind of a shrew to an elephant? And that's what we're plotting here, is the mean cell volume is not changing with body mass as we go from shrew to elephant. So red blood cells are obviously smaller than fat cells, but for those cell sizes, they're essentially flat. Okay, so that suggests that these patterns that I've been showing you, at least at some of these levels of organization, are arising independently. Okay, so we're kind of done with data. We don't have any more data to go through. I think that this pattern is very interesting, and I think that what we want to do now is kind of try to come up with a theory for this. And of course, understanding growth is so fundamental. Like, if we can understand growth, then we can, and this is natural growth, this is healthy growth. I think if we can understand healthy growth better, we have a better chance of understanding where growth breaks down, where growth becomes abnormal, such as in tumor proliferation or in disease proliferation, juvenile development, reproductive health. These are all fundamentally problems of growth. Resource management, so in fisheries, we're interested in maximum sustainable yield, but we obviously have to understand the growth of a system and how it changes with biomass in order to make clear predictions for what that yield might be. Global carbon cycling in forests and in plankton. We can't make good predictions about about carbon cycling if we don't understand turnover of forests and plankton. So there's very good applied reasons for understanding this. There's very good theoretical reasons, as I've outlined already. And so what we want to do then is to come up with a theory. So this is here because the prevailing view, I'll just go back, or maybe I'll leave this till later. The prevailing view for what's underpinning these scaling laws is that there's energetic constraints. So obviously you can't grow without energy. And even going back to the origin of life, the question often arises, is it growth first, is it a self-replicator, or is it some energy supply? But of course it has to be both. You can't have a self-replicator doing anything without an energy supply, and you can't have life without a self-replicator. So obviously growth and energy are very closely coupled, and it's difficult to untangle this so-called order of causality. But I think that there are good reasons to suggest that we need a new theory for growth scaling. And that comes from the fact that, in particular, when we're looking at ecosystem level scaling, we can't explain that from an individual level perspective. We can't explain the sub-exponential growth in a whole community based on the energetic constraints of individuals. You can double your number of individuals in a community. You won't quite double your growth, but you'll definitely double your basal metabolism. And so to suggest that metabolism is underpinning these growth relationships, I don't think it, at the ecosystem level, makes sense. I think also at the individual level, there's questions as to whether, whether growth or energy is more fundamental. And so cancer is a great example where a tumor develops, it initiates, and it ultimately needs to induce angiogenesis to supply vasculature so that it can continue its growth. But cancer is ultimately a breakdown in the regulation of growth. And so what originates there is fundamentally a growth process. The same is true for catch-up growth. This is an individual growing up to maturity, but when it reaches about 5 years old, it has an illness that arrests its growth. It doesn't grow anymore until that illness is resolved, and then it can catch up. And in fact, what it does is its growth trajectory is faster than it would have been had it never had that illness, and it catches up to the trajectory it would have been on before it reaches maturity. So to suggest that this growth is really fundamentally constrained by energetic supply, which is itself determined by body size, doesn't make any sense. Finally, the last kind of line of evidence I'll show for this sort of complicated interaction between growth and energy is just looking at the data. We've already seen the data on the left-hand side, which is maximum individual growth against body mass. On the right is metabolism for all the same species and all the same major taxa. On the left, we see that all of these line up along a near three-quarter line, whereas on the right, when you put a single line through all these major taxa, well, because mammals are warm-blooded and ectotherms are down here and unicells are down here, there's these steps between these major taxa, so a single line through them tends to be steeper. And to suggest that metabolic scaling is fundamentally underpinning growth scaling would mean that the fact that these major taxa line up is coincidence, and I don't think that's the case. So it's possible that metabolic supply architecture and other metabolic constraints are actually evolved characteristics to supply growth most efficiently. And so I think that, I think that in ecology we may have put the cart before the horse. It's an expression we have in English that suggests we've mistaken the order of causality, and in fact, we might want to turn things around. Okay, so overall, I guess these are all just suggesting different lines of evidence to suggest we need a new theory for growth scaling. And so what might that be? Let me give you two properties that I think are true for all biological systems and all the systems that we're interested in and thinking about today. So all of these systems have both continuous and discrete dynamics. So a cell enlarges and then it splits in two. And a body enlarges and then it reproduces whole. And at many levels of organization intermediate between these, we also see that there are lobular units that tend to have a certain size structure. They enlarge, but at some point they stop, and new lobular units have to be made. The same might be true of families, where a family system gets larger, but then because those individuals can't reproduce with each other, they have to go out. There's a size structure to the sizes of families, but at all these levels, there's both enlargement and replication. And this property is very closely connected to what we've already talked about, that replicators are system size invariant. So I showed you, it's a complicated way of saying the cells in the body don't change as the body gets bigger, or the bodies in an ecosystem don't get bigger or smaller as an ecosystem gets more biomass. And I think that these properties are very important because the second one, for example, already tells us that the fact that we can recognize components that have a certain size structure means that not everything is always growing. it means that something had to have stopped growing in order for us to recognize it as a, say, lobular unit or some kind of tissue complex or some kind of family group or something of that sort. In which case, we can't have exponential growth. It has to be sub-exponential. Okay, let me give you an example. This is what I'm calling the block stem model, for lack of a better word. Basically what happens is you have a small little block. It makes a copy of itself. Then there's 2. Each of those make copies of themselves. Then there's 4 and 8. But at some point, they stop growing and form a block. Now, that block can act as a template for that process to start over. So this block now acts as a template for a new small little part that makes copies, and then we get a new block. So now we have 2 blocks, and each of those can act as templates for new growth. And this process continues until there's enough of these blocks to form a super block. And that then starts the entire process over from the very beginning, and it grows up through the exact same process. So this produces power law growth in mass and time, and therefore in growth and mass. And we can tune that exponent to anything we want based on how many replications. C is the number of replications. So, you know, this is just to give you an idea that the fact that there are recognizable components, the structure of living matter has this size structure, suggests that growth has to be sub-exponential. The problem is that what we're trying to explain is that all these exponents are very similar. They're always near 3/4, and this can be tuned to anything we want. So I don't think that this is the answer. It's just to try to give us a flavor for the expectation that growth should be sub-exponential. And so what I'm suggesting then, I don't want to bog us down at this point with complicated math, because it's not really complicated. All we're doing is the exact same thing that Huxley did when he was considering the brain mass and the body mass. We're taking the derivative of the relationship of mass versus mass. Here we're taking the derivative of growth versus mass. And what we get then is when we differentiate, when we take logs and differentiate, we get that this exponent is simply the relative change in growth per relative growth. And so it's telling us that there's something about growth itself that's limiting growth. In other words, we're not considering the structure of the system at all. We're just considering the dynamics of the system, and there's no theory here. We're just playing with this simple equation. dm by dt is equal to constant times m to the power k. We're just playing with that and seeing that that exponent already, without doing anything, is telling us very simply that there's something about the dynamics themselves that are feeding back on the growth process. So what might those dynamics be? What could be underpinning this relationship? And so we can write this equation in discrete time, and basically we're saying that the growth at the next time step is equal to the growth that happened previously, plus, now if k was 1, that would be exponential growth. And g over m, growth over mass, would be a constant. Every time step, we'd have the same growth rate. But because k is less than 1, it's telling us that at every time step, only some fraction of what grew can itself grow, and only some fraction of that can itself grow. So there's this diminishing fraction at every time, and that's where this sub-exponential growth comes from. But that doesn't tell us anything about k. It just tells us that we expect that it's something about the dynamics themselves that are feeding back on growth. So I'd like to go deeper into kind of growth itself, and think about what are the bases of growth. What are the basic processes that underpin growth? And one of the first questions, maybe the way to do this is to consider compound frequency. So you give me $1, and at the end of a year, I give you $2. I gave you 100% interest on your $1. But you can actually do better than that if you get half of your interest after 6 months. Because you can compound the first 6 months into the second 6 months and get a little bit more return on your investment. So at the end of a year, then you'd have $2.25. And you could get 1/12 of your interest every month. And every month that could get compounded. And at the end of the year, then you would have $2.60 some. And so I wonder if anybody knows how much you'd get if you compounded your interest every single second. You got a tiny little fraction of your interest, and it summed up over to 100% at the end of the year. How much money would you have at the end of the year? Does anyone know what that number is? Because it's a very famous number. It's a very beautiful number. And I'll just tell you what it is. The number is E. This is where the number E was actually, this is how the number E was discovered, was by considering questions of compound interest by Jacob Bernoulli. This is the accumulation function used in finance. So 1 plus 1 over n, all raised to the power n. And as n goes to infinity, then the number approaches E. So in fact, 2 and E are very special numbers because they represent the limits of this process. You can't get less than $2, you can't get more than E dollars for 100% interest on $1. And these numbers 2 and E come up over and over and over again. You could think of a different function, the sum of 1 over n factorial. When n is 1, you get 2. When n is infinity, you get E. Here's another way to think about it. You could have a division process, so you have a branching process. Let's say these are cells, and every single day, all your cells divide in 2. You'd obviously grow very fast, but if it was, you know, if every single morning at 6 o'clock all your cells divided, then your accumulation would be 2. Whereas if all you knew that on average every day all your cells divide, but you knew nothing else about that, then your accumulation would be E. This is sort of the minimum and the maximum entropy versions, distributions of this doubling time. And again, these two limits are 2 and E. These are very, very special numbers. This 2 is at the base of logarithms for discrete fields like computer science. E is at the base of logarithms for math and physics. And that's because you know, these are very much the bases of growth, as it were. And so I wonder if this k value is actually somehow represented by the ratio of discrete and continuous processes. Certainly, this number is very close to the exponent that we're seeing in all these systems, but we don't have a really good explanation for why this might come about. The way I kind of think about it is like you could zoom in on the cell and you could look at it dividing in 2, okay? But then you'd zoom out and see the aggregate mass, it's actually growing continuously. And then that aggregate mass is eventually going to make a copy of itself, because we know that these discrete and continuous dynamics are working at every level of organization. But then if you zoomed out even further, you'd see that that process is growing continuously. And how are all these processes connected to one another? They have to be. They have to be integrated, and they have to be growing in this kind of integrated fashion. And so it suggests that, you know, it suggests in a very hand-wavy way, we certainly don't have any answers, but you know, it suggests that maybe this, that starting with this number might guide us down a path that leads us to an explanation that is abstract and general and you know, doesn't depend on any of the specific system details. So, and so, why are there not more lions? Well, I knew that transition wouldn't work well, but we got so far up in the clouds there, I thought, you know, let's get back down to earth. This is where I started my research. It was in African savanna, and I had the question, why are there not more lions? It was the question that really fascinated me and drove me. And so I don't want to end on this idea of 2 over E and all that, because it's very abstract, and I think that you know, it's not the right way to end. So I want to end with this question, and I want to end talking about the animals themselves. Like the lions and the hyenas and the wild dog, because one thing I raised earlier in the talk was that we don't understand what's controlling interaction strength. We don't understand what's controlling that Q parameter that moves us up and down that line. We can make very nice predictions for the intercept of that line, RG over M, if you remember. We can make, our model is very stable, so that's good. It can predict in different systems, but we don't really understand what's controlling the interaction strength between predators and prey. And so I thought I would just put this slide up and discuss some of the behaviors. These are individual behaviors that these carnivores exhibit that I think are having ecological effects, like ecological level consequences. And so I don't know if this can be understood directly, but I'll walk you through it. Basically, lions commit infanticide, and they're not the only ones to commit infanticide. Tigers do it, leopards do it. And what I think that these behaviors, the consequences of these behaviors is I think they feed back on the predators and on the prey environment. So when prey are very abundant, then predators tend to stay in their pride lands quite happily and consume the prey, and everything is fine. But as those prey start to diminish in numbers and become scarce, then predators are forced to roam further afield and encounter new prides. And in doing so, if those prides have offspring, young cubs, then very often they'll kill them. And I think what that tends to do then is it slows the reproduction of the population. The productivity of the population is somehow set back because now they have to start over and rear new cubs. And so what that does is then allows in the next generation the prey to recover, and then we can move back to the system that we started with. So there's this negative feedback on growth. There's this kind of homeostatic feedback on growth through this individual level behavior. Another example is siblicide in hyenas. So hyenas are known to have some of the richest milk among terrestrial mammals. But they also commit siblicide, which is where one pup will prevent the other one from feeding from the mother, and eventually it dies. And I think that that behavior might be mediated by the quality of the milk, which would be mediated by the prey environment. So when prey are abundant, there's lots of prey around, the mother's milk is very rich, and so siblicide is less frequent. But as the prey environment diminishes, then that's when siblicide might occur more frequently. And again, that would reduce the recruitment into the next generation, which would allow the prey to recover and return us back to the original system. There's some evidence for this, at least in that the dominant females always tend to rear 2 pups, whereas the subdominants tend to only rear 1. And I think that's because the dominant females are able to consume as much as they want and are never forced to give up prey when their carcass is available. And finally, the wild dogs are very interesting animals. They are alpha structure packs. When prey are abundant, they tend to have a preferred prey resource, certain body size classes that they target. As prey become sparse, then often these packs will fuse together, and effectively that cuts reproduction in half because of the alpha structure, where there were 2 dominant females, 2 alpha females. Now there's only 1, which basically halves reproduction. The other thing they do is they can then target larger prey, because as larger groups they're able to take down larger prey. So that has the effect again of releasing their preferred prey from this top-down control. They can rebound and again return the system back to its original state. So I'm not sure if this is very speculative. It's really, now we're at the end. I thought I would put that in there because I think it's an interesting idea for how individual level behaviors might have population level consequences. So I'll just summarize what I talked about. I presented a bit of the history about power laws in biology. In particular, these kind of structural relationships, which are mass against mass, and the rationale is that underpinning those is some functional relationship between their growth rates. Then I talked about these sort of functional relationships, which are rate versus mass, like metabolism, like growth. In fact, these patterns are so unbelievably numerous. We have consumption and excretion and dispersal and all the different factors of growth. The timing of different events, like life history events, like gestation, maturity, lifespan, are all underpinned by the same kind of the same scaling laws. In fact, the number of breaths in your lifespan is almost the same as the number of breaths in the lifespan of a mouse, almost the same number of breaths in the lifespan of a whale. And that's because all of these patterns are connected and can be renormalized by rescaling time, essentially. And they're often assumed to be underpinned by some structural constraint. And I argued that maybe instead of looking at structural constraints to understand functional relations, we should go deeper into the function to try to understand what the rates of these processes might, how these rates of processes might feed back on the growth itself. Then I showed you data for predators and prey. These are structural relationships, the mass of one trophic level against the mass of another, and they reveal very regular patterns across different biomes of the world. And underpinning those, we believe, is these functional relationships in the rate of productivity against biomass. Now, the rate of growth somehow depends on the size of the population itself. And it's not exponential. It seems to continue growing. It seems to just keep continuing growing, but at a diminishing rate. So growth is always happening faster and faster, but slower and slower, as it were, as the system gets larger. This is sub-exponential, and it has profound consequences for how we understand the interactions in ecology, competitive interactions, trophic interactions, so that it's possible that this intrinsic functional form of growth can actually explain many of the things we observe in nature, the diversity we see, the balance between predators and prey, and how they avert tragedy of the commons. All of these things might be explained by the intrinsic form of growth rather than external consequences. Then I showed you what I think is really the most interesting, and that is that this pattern recapitulates across these different levels of organization, from embryos to individuals to populations and to ecosystems. No matter where on the tree of life or the tree of eukaryotes that we look at, no matter what level of organization, growth seems to follow this similar functional form. And then I really waved my hands about trying to get to a theory that might explain this, and in particular, what are the bases of growth? What are the, how are all these levels of organization growing simultaneously in an integrated fashion in a way that might connect discrete and continuous processes? And I suggested maybe the number itself of 2 over E could guide us towards some understanding of these patterns. Certainly, when we've chosen other numbers like 2/3 in the past, we thought some of these patterns were dominated by the number 2/3, and that led us to a certain kind of reasoning. It led us down the path of considering surface and volume constraints. And now we understand surface and volume very well, and I think genuinely those are very important concepts in biology. I think that the numbers 2 and E could provide us a different kind of thinking about what is underpinning the dynamics and how these dynamics are themselves feeding back on the growth process. And so with that, I want to acknowledge some of my collaborators that have shaped my thinking over the past few years, some of the funding sources that have helped me along, and then I want to thank David again for inviting me, and the Center for Theoretical Study for hosting me the last month. It's been really fantastic to be here, and thank you again for your patience.